Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches Poetry. In this video, we're going to be talking about Wilfred Owen's extraordinary poem, Exposure, from the Edexcel Conflict collection, although I know it is in a lot of different exam boards, so it will be relevant whichever exam board you are studying. We're going to have a little look at content, so what the poem's about, and then I'm going to take you through some contextual details, and then we'll finish up with some notes on form and structure. There is another video coming your way with 5 key quotes explained, so just look out for that one. But for now, let's get started. Okay, so what is this poem all about? Exposure by Wilfred Owen is an autobiographical poem about warfare in the trenches, but more importantly, it focuses less on the war and the fighting itself, and instead looks at the power of nature and how their exposure to the weather is more dangerous, more harmful than the fighting itself. Indeed, in this poem, it is very much the weather that is presented as a dangerous enemy to their safety. The poem explores those dreadful conditions. It also describes the way that the soldiers attempt to take comfort in dreams or maybe hypothermic-based hallucinations, but ultimately come to the conclusion that their only out is death, and that in some ways either they've lost their faith in God or God has abandoned them. And the poem ends very bleakly with the image of a burying party come to remove the bodies of those men who have died not from a bullet, but actually from exposure to the cold. So Wilfred Owen is one of the most famous World War I poets, and there are so many extraordinary poems that he's written. It's really worth going and having a little look at some of the other poems that he wrote, because they are incredibly moving. So he was born in 1893, and sadly he died in 1918. And the really awful thing is that he died a week before World War I was over. In fact, his family found out about his death on Armistice Day, which, I mean, it's just so devastating. So, as you can tell, he died in November 1917. Now, he suffered greatly, as did all the soldiers, and people at home. But one thing that is interesting about his experience is that in 1917, he ended up in Craiglockhart Hospital, which was a hospital in Edinburgh. And he was suffering from shell shock, which is what we would now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And it was whilst he was in Craiglockhart Hospital that he actually wrote a lot of his poetry reflecting upon his experiences in war. And he met another poet there called Siegfried Sassoon, another very, very famous war poet from that time, who kind of acted as like a mentor for him. And he showed him a lot of his work, and they worked his poetry, and they worked on it together. In fact, you can actually get your hands on, just Google it, if you look up Anthem for Doomed Youth, which is another one of Wilfred Owen's very famous poems, you can see images of his early drafts with Siegfried Sassoon's scrawls, and you can kind of trace through the drafting and redrafting of the poetry. If you're a bit of a poetry geek like me, it's very cool. And it also answers the question of did he really mean it? Yeah, he did, because he really thought about the words in the poem. So obviously he experienced war in the trenches out in France, and this poem is obviously very much indicating the horrors of life in the trenches and the conditions out there. Now, aside from the fact that they were horrifically cramped and full of rats and people got trench foot, this particular period of time that he's writing about in 1917 was one of the coldest winters on record. And so a lot of the soldiers suffered greatly because of exposure to that weather. A lot of them got frostbite, a lot of them suffered from hypothermia, and actually, a lot of the deaths were weather-based as opposed to fighting. Now, when Wilfred Owen died, he did die because he was shot. He didn't, but obviously he experienced this horrendous weather. In fact, in some of his own writing, I've popped up the little quote for you there, he wrote, "We were marooned in a frozen desert. There was not a sign of life on the horizon and 1,000 signs of death. The marvel is we did not all die of cold." And you can see how that resonates in the poem Exposure massively. Okay, just a little bit on form for you here. So the poem is organised into 8 stanzas of 5 lines, so quintets or quintains, you can say either or. And you'll notice that there is a sort of rhyme scheme, okay, and the sort of rhyme scheme is A, B, B, A, C. Okay, now the reason I say sort of is because these rhymes are largely half rhymes, or what we call para rhymes. So half rhymes might be just the last syllable rhymes, but para rhymes is when the actual vowel sound is just slightly off. So the best example for would be from the first stanza, you've got knive, us, and nervous. So us and us of nervous, they're like almost rhymes, but not quite. Do you see what I mean? And this is all the way through the poem. So in terms of the impact of that, I think this is all about that sense of discomfort and lack of almost, I want to say closure, because that's sort of what rhymes give us. They give us that like sense of satisfaction when there's like a complete rhyme, but because everything's off, it just leaves you slightly unsatisfied. And so I think it's really representing the unease and the discomfort that they are feeling, that being unsettled by their conditions. You'll also notice that there's real metrical irregularity through these lines, like they don't have matching syllable length and stresses as they go through. But one thing that you can say is that the first 4 lines of each stanza are longer. Yeah, they're all between 11 and 14 syllables. But every 5th line is considerably shorter, okay, and you start to get actually a refrain building up in these 5th lines. Not in every stanza, but certainly in 4 of them you get this, but nothing happens, but nothing happens. And that shorter 5th line is meant to sort of symbolically represent the anticlimax of war. That this sort of really kind of difficult situation where you're waiting for something, but that's all you're doing, you're waiting, and ultimately what you seem to be waiting for is death. So depressing, I'm sorry, like my video on the 5 points to explore is equally depressing, but there's no way of doing it any other way because of the content of the poem. Hopefully that was helpful. Give me a shout if you need anything else, and if the videos are helpful, then please do share them about with your buddies, and click that subscribe button because it is very helpful to me. That's it. Keep an eye out for the 5 key quotations explored. That's coming up soon too. That's it from me. Thank you so much. Happy revising.